So what I'll speak to is the role of the spatial sciences in health and what's been happening in that space over the last couple of decades and maybe 1.5 centuries actually. And I'll introduce the concept of space, a perspective that I believe that as spatial scientists we need to embrace a lot more than we have been in the past. And I'll use a couple of examples to illustrate the interaction between place and space in the context of global health, and pass a few recommendations pertaining to how we can move forward and increase and improve our relevance in the health space. So when we think spatial or space, everyone who's attending this conference would be fully aware of our function in terms of Earth observation and measurement. So disciplines like surveying, land surveying, and all forms of surveying, including the geoinformation sciences and remote sensing. It's immediately apparent what we mean when we talk about space. And the application of the spatial sciences in health dates back as far as 1854, where John Snow, who's largely branded as the father of modern day epidemiology, used mapping essentially to identify the location of cholera deaths in London. So some of you are familiar with this story. There was a cholera outbreak and no one knew what was really causing the death of people, and John Snow managed to map all the deaths and also managed to map out the location of all the pumps where people drew water from. So John Snow managed to identify that the deaths were clustering around a particular pump, and he commissioned for that pump to be closed, and that stopped the spread of the cholera. So an early example of the application of mapping or surveying in the context of health, and two things that are still consistent up to today is, from this example, the function of space as an organizing principle for health data. We use maps to describe the geographic trends in disease outbreaks or deaths. But also we realize that space or geography can be the medium through which health is mediated, right? So what does that mean? That means in this particular case of John Snow, it was a function of proximity to the tap that determined your demise. Fast forward 150, 160 years later, we use the same, we use more sophisticated techniques than John Snow had, and we still identify the same pump as the cause of, or the potential cause for the deaths. So today we still use geography or the spatial sciences in a similar way. Space is used as an organizing principle. This is an example of a dashboard from Johns Hopkins University highlighting the trends in cholera deaths across the world. So geography is used as a container of disease information, and this can be useful, and this is useful for targeting health interventions. But also geography is still the medium through which health is mediated, right? This is an example from France illustrating the changes in mobility after lockdown measures were introduced in March last year, right? So mobility, which in a sense is a function of geography physically, can actually determine whether or not you are at risk of COVID. So now introducing place, we've spoken about the function of space, and place is a more elusive term, right? Sometimes place is used quite loosely, but place refers to both the physical and human characteristics of the location. When we use space as a container of health information, we essentially perform aggregate analysis in GIS, And we know that aggregate analysis is essentially incapable of distinguishing between the contextual, which is the difference that a place makes, and the compositional, what is contained in a place. So place is more subjective and less intuitive term that speaks specifically to the contextual rather than the compositional matters that make up spaces. Right? So I'll just give you an example of some of the work that we've done in Mozambique to illustrate the function of place in the context of the work that we do. So with regards to maternal health, just a background, we know that every 2 minutes a woman dies because of pregnancy-related complications. And the risk factors that are associated with these deaths are wide and varied beyond what's clinical. We know that there are many determinants outside the woman's medical condition that influence whether or not she'll experience a positive pregnancy outcome. So our objective in the Mozambique work was to try to elicit new information from the community pertaining to the risk factors that contribute to death. So we adopted a mixed method approach where we did both qualitative and quantitative work. By qualitative, I mean to say we went into the communities and actually asked specific people in the community what they thought these risk factors were. And the purpose for this was to get a sense of the context where we're going to be working. So after we did the qualitative work, we then went ahead to actually measure some of the issues that were raised by the community, right? In terms of the variables, there were 18 variables that I won't get into too much detail to talk about, but 6 of them ended up explaining the trends that we saw in the adverse maternal outcomes. And I'd like to highlight family support and physical isolation, which were actually described by the community as important from the qualitative work, ended up being really significant in explaining the outcome. So the illustration here shows us that without having done the qualitative work, we would not have known the importance of measuring the value of family support in determining whether or not a woman experiences a good pregnancy outcome. So there's what we measure and how we measure it, and what speaks to context. What we measure requires a lot more than just computing the metrics of space. It requires additional effort to actually know what's happening on the ground. When you talk about context now at a much bigger scale, and this is an example that's not from my work, but from the work that's being done at Facebook, where they're using social media and people's behaviors and social characteristics to determine how connected people are, and in a sense, use the same approach to predict potential spread of COVID. So again, you are getting a sense of what context is, not necessarily by qualitative techniques in the traditional sense of the word, but tapping into people's social characteristics using social media. So context matters, but we understand context, and then we link the context to the health outcomes. But it's essential to take a step further if we're going to have impact on improving health, right? So besides using geography as an organizing principle for health data, and also using, understanding that geography can mediate health outcomes. Geography can be the basis for precision intervention in health. And just to illustrate, go back to the story of John Snow. Whilst he's the one who managed to map out the spread of the cholera disease and isolate a particular pump, it was Father Henry Whitehead, a priest in the Church of England, who actually put on his gumboots and went into the field and put a lock on the pump. using information that had been generated by John Snow. The symbolic significance of this is that we produce information and we produce evidence that's useful for health practitioners, but it's only really useful for improving health if it's put in the hands of people who actually implement the evidence. So in our work in Mozambique, we've taken all our data, our evidence, all our models, and we have packaged those into an application called Mapping Outcomes for Mothers. So we're taking GIS now and packaging it into something that can be used by minimally trained community health workers who probably have never read a map before, to inform their daily duties, right? So using MOM, they can inform women in their community of their community-specific risk factors that are related to their pregnancies. We've also translated our geographic models into an app that is used by community health workers to link them to locally available transport and also tap into cultural practices to facilitate for savings. Again, you see, this is an issue of context. We're moving beyond just the metrics of space. And we also use GIS to inform women of travel risk based on weather records. So going forward, some of the key lessons that I've learned that what we need to be adopting at scale concerning our functioning in the health space, there's potential for qualitative GIS, integrating unconventional to us as engineers, as surveyors, methods, qualitative methods as part of our thinking and analysis, or as part of asking questions. There's a lot of potential in terms of content learning from social media. Big social media companies are already publishing open data sets that are geocoded, that are useful for informing health decisions. And this will be useful for going towards a geographically precise global health, where we translate our geographical models into tools for more precisely targeting interventions. We need to embrace interdisciplinarity. Our emphasis as surveyors usually is on how to measure, but when it comes to health, not necessarily what to measure. So new ways of solving new or old problems requires us to ask the question, what? And that propels us to explore other avenues in terms of methods that are not necessarily conventional to the discipline of surveying. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Makanga. Thank you so much, Dr. Makanga. You've raised quite some interesting points there. Interdisciplinarity, not just doing things and keeping them to ourselves, but getting to a point where we engage the policymakers as well, so that whatever we are producing is very useful. I guess this is a very important message for the young surveyors, the youngsters who are coming up. And it's not just about innovation, but your innovation needs to be out there. And also a message to our audience, if you've got any questions, you can use the question and answer panel, and then we'll try to attend to your questions. Moving forward, our next speaker is Kes Dejoux. He's the director of Cadastre International. And as one of my friends likes to say all the time, there is a land footprint in all societal problems. And this is a man who has been working with land, I believe, for most of his career. So despite facing a challenge, a global pandemic as we are right now, most of these solutions, just as we have learned from Tatenda's presentations, are probably rooted in how we manage our resources. So over to you, Kes.
Thank you very much, Shirley. I hope that everybody can hear me around the world and you can see my presentation. So I'm very privileged to be with you. After the presentation of Tatenda on health, I want to take you into the theme of land and water management. And I want to look a little bit into the future, but you all know looking into the future is very difficult. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take you first to the past, and I will use my own professional pathway to show you how the world can change during a career, and maybe what that can mean for your career in the future. So I will start in the past in my own pathway. I will tell you a little bit about the water challenges and the land challenges that I've seen, but also about land administration and how we can achieve good goals in that. And then I want to finalize my keynote with your future. And I just hope to get you inspired based on my professional pathway as I followed it. So first I go back into the past, and my pathway started somewhere, my professional pathway, in 1986. And I started as a young student in land and water management, and I went into Mali to work in irrigation schemes, the design and the implementation of agricultural to produce rice, produce peanuts. And you can see that although the water management is the field of work, there was already leveling and surveying involved in that work. After that, I started working in Rwanda in erosion control. And from irrigation and drainage, I stepped into land degradation. So, and I put some pictures, and they're a bit small, but you can see that you can use also spirit levels and garden hoses just to do surveying or leveling work. And as you all know, in the middle, the team building and drinking some beers with your colleagues is always important as well. But in that work, I learned how to use techniques which are very simple to achieve some results, even if you don't have the equipment. Then I went for several years to Bolivia, and I stepped into a project which was about agroecological zoning. And apart from agriculture, also ecology came in. Because you should realize this is in the 90s. This was really a new movement. But also GIS became very important, and the use of satellite imagery. And if I talk about satellite imagery in those days, it was still very complicated. It was expensive. It was not available as it is nowadays. And also the use of GIS was quite a kind of fancy modern thing in the 90s. So this is really where it started getting involved in data collection and using GIS and remote sensing. Then I stepped into environmental sciences. I stepped back to the Netherlands, the country where I was born, and I worked at the University of Wageningen. And there I learned a lot about agricultural and ecosystems. It is not only about producing food, but there is a relation between food and the ecosystem you're running in. And I just put some pictures, I picked out. One is in Pakistan, where salinization of agricultural grounds are very important, but they are related to the ecosystem they are in. I was in Indonesia in 2005, where the tsunami took place. But also I was in Suriname, where deforestation is a big problem. So water management became much more water and land management in my career. And then I ended up where I'm still now today at Cadastre International. And I entered into the field of land administration. And as you can see, I moved a little bit from water to land, but geoinformation and remote sensing and survey, it was always there. In this image I just put, but this is a bit of nostalgic photograph already. My last international travel, it was in Algeria on the top, 2020. I could not imagine at that time in February last year that would be my last international travel for a year. But due, of course, to the COVID pandemic, I'm also, like everybody of you, grounded to my home office. So if you look at my pathway, then you can see that I started somewhere at water management. I came into land degradation. I went into agroecological zoning, and then agricultural and ecosystems became important. And nowadays I'm in the land administration part. But always the surveying, the remote sensing, and the GIS, it was always there. It was like a kind of a support tool to all the work that I've done during my career. And there were two, well, let's say, influences from outside, and I had to adapt to that, both at the water part as in the land part. If you look at the water part, I started in irrigation and drainage. It was all about agriculture. And then water came not only as one thing for agriculture, but we understood that there is also relation to the ecosystem. So water became water for food and ecosystems. And I think that the trend of today, or the movement of today, is that we start considering food as a service from nature. And I think this conceptual change in thinking is only taking place in one generation, my generation. So it's really a movement in the water area. And I think in the land area, you can have the same kind of movement, the same kind of development, where it started as being, for me, all about agriculture. I found out at a certain moment that it's not only about agriculture, but it's about land management, it's about planning, and it's about conservation of land. And nowadays, I'm really in the field of land administration, realizing that without proper land administration, all this land management and planning and conservation and agriculture, which I did in the past, are becoming much more difficult. So also at the land part, I had to develop together with my environment. And I'm telling you this because I think for your future as a surveyor or whatever you are, a GIS specialist or a remote sensing specialist, you will have the same kind of influences to your profession that will happen to you. So I'm now going a bit into the future because there is still a lot to be done. And there is one good thing as a starting point for you, and those are called the Sustainable Development Goals. At my time in the 80s, there were no Sustainable Development Goals. It is only the Millennium Goals that came in earlier this century, but at that time we did not have this guidance. Nowadays we have it. It's a very good starting point, I think. And we should realize that for about 70% of the world population, the land administration is not there. There is no registration of the relation between people or even animals or nature and the environment. So I've been around a lot this last few years if it comes to land administration, and land administration can be anything. And I just took 3 pictures of a difference. It can be on the left, where it's almost undoable to start working. But in many countries, it's like in the middle, where it's a paper-based kind of archive that you have to work with. And in some parts of the world, it's already very modern, and you have all kind of mainframes who are doing all kind of calculations for you. But I think my most important drive to do this work is where I ended now. It's about land rights for all. It's really a wonderful field of work I'm in, and it's really a privilege to work on land rights for all. And if I say for all, I also really mean for all. It's not about men or women. It's not about black or white. It's not about poor or rich. It's not about even maybe people and animals. It's about land rights for all. And if you want to work in that, I think you need 3 things. You need some guidance, you need an approach how to do it, and you have to start doing it. You have to work on it, so you need practice. And well, I'm a lucky guy because I think I have been involved in all 3 of them. If we talk about the guidance, I think the work that we do within UNGGIM is wonderful. We make a framework for effective land administration, and it really gives, hopefully, the world guidance on where to go when it comes to land rights. If it's an approach, there are many approaches, but one of the approaches that I would like to take out today with you is the fit-for-purpose land administration approach, which really helps people in the world that you can achieve something with the means that you have. And please refer to my first slides where we use just a garden hose and a spirit level to do something. If that is the technology that you have available, then you have to work with that and you can achieve results. But if you have a total station, of course, this is another thing. The role of the surveyor, I think, is very important in this. And normally we think that the surveying is about the centimeter precision. But I think the role of the surveyor is also to make decisions on what is fit for purpose. And if you can use all kind of technology and come to a decimeter precision, which is necessary for that situation, you have to decide to use that. But maybe even if that's not available and it's not necessary, you can work with satellite imagery and have a meter precision, which is much more suitable for that situation. So the profession of the surveyor of the future, for me, also lies in making this kind of decisions and finding the right precision and the right attitude for the work you have to be doing. I just give you 3 examples. One example is from Nepal, where we worked and we used just prints of satellite imagery, and we have visual boundaries drawing on that by people. And of course we use the technological background that we have, and if there is a possibility to have an automatic feature extraction by borders that we see in the image, we already use that as a basis. But the combination of visual boundaries and automatic feature extraction works very well in Nepal. If we go to Indonesia, we have an example where we don't use only surveyors, but we have a participative form of mapping. We involve the people in the mapping of their own areas by using modern techniques as tablets, which are widely available nowadays in the world. And the last example that I have is where we go to Colombia, where we use smart devices, RTK. And I always like this picture so much because there's this little fellow in the middle. I think he's about 15 or 16 years old. He's having training of 30 minutes on using this device. And then he can help in his village in doing the surveying and do the land administration for his fellow citizens. It's really impressive to see how you can do that. So just some examples on how land administration is evolving and how it can be used. So that brings me to your future, because I try to take you from my perspective, how my professional pathway was, into your future, and you will experience the same things as I did. You think now that you have your plans for the future and you will be professional for what you're doing now, but you will see that your profession will evolve over time, and maybe you will end up somewhere else that you can think of now. So I cannot look for you in the future. I cannot define where our profession is going, but I see some issues that are there, and I want to mention that as a closure of my presentation. First of all, we have this SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. It's really a unique point of start. And for all of you who never read the document, I really want to promote to you, please read it, because it will make you happy to see that you can make a better world and that our profession is having a role in doing so. I think for the future also the role of a virtual world will become more and more important. You will run into things like artificial intelligence or digital twins. And I'm sure during your conference this weekend, but also in the FIG Working Week coming end of June, those are themes that are really going to be discussed on what it will mean for our profession. Data will really become so important in the future. And it has to do, of course, with this virtual world, but also the connection between the two. So the data integration and the interoperability, it will be really an issue for your profession in the future, I think. And then there's always, of course, the technology. And the technology, well, I just put a picture because I'm really impressed by that. I think it's a picture of the latest iPhone 12. And the iPhone 12 has LiDAR in it. And it's really incredible if you think about it, because our profession of surveying is now consumer electronics. And you will end up somewhere over 5 years or 10 years time, you will end up in a village with your total station on all your machines. And there will be this little guy of 16 holding his telephone and say, well, listen, it's very complicated what you do, but why don't we just use my phone with a LiDAR to make an image of this area? It's really going to evolve that fast, I'm sure. And the last point, I think, is one of the very important issues in your future, is the capacity development. It's all about getting people involved and do the work we have to do. I mentioned that there is still 70% of the world, the job has to be done. And that's a lot of people, that's a lot of work. And we cannot do it with the technology and with the approaches of today. You have to develop new approaches, new technology, and new interoperability, and a new virtual world to come to that results. So I wish you very much success doing so. And I hope I gave you, based on my pathway in land and water management, I gave you just a sense of inspiration that you can end up at very beautiful things that you can work on. So thank you very much all for your attention, and wishing you a very good conference during this weekend. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kes. I feel for you. It must have been difficult trying to adjust to not traveling so much. That's a very interesting career path you have there. Thank you so much. So moving forward, we are going to go into our session now. So to our audience, if you look at the left side of your screen, there is a session with a now on it. So you can click there. That's where we are going to go for our para sessions. We have a panel discussion on Agenda 2030, sustainability in times of uncertainty. And then we also have a presentation session where we are going to be discussing issues relating to professional development and knowledge sharing, as well as integrated planning and management of land and water resources. So you can just choose whatever session you're comfortable with, but you can switch between the sessions with time. So I'll see you there. Thank you so much.